This is Duke University.
I think we'll speak a little bit more today and be able to have more discussion some of the other days. We wanted to give some introductory remarks about the seminar as a whole and what we have in mind. This is Sandro Mezzadra. He teaches political theory at the University of Bologna in a political science department. My name is Michael Hart. I think I actually also teach political theory in the literature program here at Duke. In some ways, the basis for this is a dissatisfaction with the functioning of the term neoliberalism as a name for contemporary capital. Neoliberalism is often defined as, in some ways, as a retreat of the state and as hence a new form of governance. Or this is maybe a way of saying the same thing as a combination of privatization, deregulation, destruction of welfare, destruction of organized labor. And maybe you could put this all under the rubric of anti-Keynesianism. Like neoliberalism starting roughly in the 1970s. One often thinks about Reagan, Thatcher governments as a paradigm for this. As an attack on the Keynesian state, which was defined by all of those negative things I just said in some ways. Public control, regulation, construction of welfare, integral governmental role for organized labor and other organized forms. I'll speak for me now. I think this is, in some ways, been a very helpful way of understanding neoliberalism, contemporary capital, but we were thinking that with two dissatisfactions that could set up the 4 days of this seminar. One of them is really by the negative conception of the term, that neoliberalism is thought as anti or as destruction, in negative terms in that sense. Like I said, as anti-Keynesianism or as a destruction of a series of things that in some ways went along with Keynesianism, or you could just say in another way, define the previous system of capitalist production and rule. Like I say, by government assistance, government regulation, etc. So we're in some ways dissatisfied with the only negative way of saying it, so that thinking of neoliberalism only in the terms of what it destroys. We'd rather do, or this is what we're trying to do in these 4 days, is to say what it does, like to try to define neoliberalism in positive terms. Yeah, by positive here, it's the confusion when you try to teach Foucault and students say, oh, positive power. What I mean is just what it does, not what it takes away or what it doesn't do. Think of neoliberalism in positive terms, in terms of what it does. The second is maybe a bit more complicated and will make sense as we keep talking, which is that I think that neoliberalism has primarily been understood as a mode of accumulation, and we want to think of it instead as a mode of production. So so it's thought of as a shift in the mode of accumulation. So even the by now quasi-classic term that David Harvey uses as the slogan for neoliberalism, accumulation by dispossession, is naming the way that capital accumulates wealth or accumulates value in the contemporary era. We want to look instead at the way that it produces value. Like what are the forms, what is the shift within the capitalist mode of production that is defined in the contemporary era? So in some ways, and maybe this is what I'm passing to Sandro right now, these 4 concepts or keywords or that we designated for each of those seminars are 4 different approaches to answer what are the shifts in the contemporary mode of capitalist production. How does capital produce today? Well, it's not even how capital produces today. It's really how we produce today. I mean, that's actually what we want to get at. See, let me also preview one of the things I'll come back to in a minute, which is that it could be, I think that insofar as neoliberalism is thought of in negative terms, especially in negative terms with regard to Keynesianism, and I should point out that the primary theorists of neoliberalism, starting with the Germans and Austrians at the beginning of the 20th century, coming up to Milton Friedman, etc., for all of them, the primary antagonist is Keynes. Like he's enemy number one. So that neoliberals think of Keynesianism as the antagonist, and I think also the critics of neoliberalism primarily think of Keynesianism as the antagonist to neoliberalism, and hence many of the sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit answers to neoliberalism is a return to Keynesianism. Like that's what seems to me. I think that if we see it in negative terms, I think it gets stuck in that binary way, neoliberalism, Keynesianism. By looking at what neoliberalism does, or rather the ways that people produce under neoliberalism, one can arrive at a different answer, at a different alternative to neoliberalism, rather than a return to Keynesianism.
So the basic idea behind this issue and behind the seminar is that extraction, logistics, and finance are something more than strategic sectors of economic activity. On the one hand, this is because they are deeply intertwined in their operations. On the other hand, it is because we are convinced that an analysis of extraction, logistics, and finance allows to kind of distillate a logics of operation of contemporary capitalism that is relevant well beyond the boundaries between these three sectors. So at the core of our project and also of this seminar is a very general question about the ways in which capitalism operates, functions today. And there are, of course, other scholars who have been engaged, who are engaged in similar investigations. Let me just mention Saskia Sassen's last book. The title is Expulsions. Saskia Sassen asks a similar question, connecting, for instance, fracking, finance, and logistics. But the problem with Saskia Sassen is that, in my opinion, she is too exclusively focused on the working of expulsions, of exclusion, and you have here a link with the topic of primitive accumulation, to which we will return later. The problem is that Sassen, in a brilliant analysis, leaves aside the investigation of the new forms and codes of incorporation that articulate and traverse the opening of literal and metaphoric new spaces for the accumulation of capital. So I am convinced that there is a need to move beyond a kind of normative understanding of inclusion as the characteristic feature of the Keynesian welfare state and welfare capitalism. And here I touch upon the point that was made by Michael with respect to neoliberalism. There is really in critical debates surrounding contemporary capitalism and neoliberalism a widespread tendency to pit contemporary capitalism and neoliberalism against Keynesianism taken as a kind of norm, as a kind of standard. And one of the stakes in our projects and in this seminar is precisely to move beyond this kind of normative standard identified with the Keynesian welfare state. I should also add that extraction, logistics, and finance have been at the center of multiple attempts to critically understand contemporary capitalism. I guess you are all familiar with many theories of financialization, and we will come back to this point on Thursday. But also logistics has recently entered kind of vocabulary of critical theory. Just think of the work of Anna Tsing on supply chain capitalism, of the work of series of scholars, among them Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, the geographer, yes. Okay, sorry. I was just mentioning the name of the geographer Deborah Cowan. I mean, just to give you a couple of references in order to understand how lively the debate on what is often called logistical capitalism is. And I will come back later to the question of extraction. But to say a couple of words more about the current project I am involved with, with Brett, what is at stake is precisely an attempt to move beyond the unilateral focus of many of these attempts on just one sector. I mean, taking finance, taking logistics as the key kind of feature of contemporary capitalism. What we try to do is rather to produce resonances between finance, logistics, and extraction in order to distillate kind of unitary logics of contemporary capitalism. And particularly important in our project is the notion of operation. We speak of operations of capital in order to be able to identify specific capitalist actors that it is possible to isolate precisely looking at the way in which they operate. The concept of operation allows us, on the one hand, to emphasize the way in which each operation of capital hits the ground, and on the other hand, to ask important theoretical and empirical questions about the articulation of each operation with multifarious networks of operations. From this point of view, what we are trying to do is to reframe the discussion of a set of vexed questions, as for instance, the relation between capital and capitalism, or the relation between what Marx used to call fractions of capital and total capital, Gesamtkapital. So what we are trying to investigate is the way in which capital emerges as a kind of unitary actor in the contemporary world. And one further question that we are asking is which are the features in the current operations of capital that allow us to speak of a capitalism beyond the historical form of industrial capitalism.
So I thought I should give you two hypotheses that we work on, which I think inform the way we're doing this seminar. The first one is really a conceptual proposition or hypothesis, which is that the current form, that in order to understand the current form of capitalist, one has to think in terms of a shift from profit to rent. This is a sort of slogan for us, and let me try to fill it in a little bit. In some ways, this goes along with something Sandro and I are going to have to develop also more on Thursday, which is the idea that finance, and maybe even all of these other forms that we're talking about here too, are not merely parasitical forms, but that are also productive forms. Like, it's not that capital has decayed or degenerated from its industrial form, but that we're in a non-industrial or non-hegemonic industrial form. I didn't say that right. We're in a form of capital in which industry is no longer hegemonic. But what we're trying to do is understand that. And so for us, for Tony and me, this shift from profit to rent does that just in this way, that what profit really meant in the industrial paradigm was that the capitalist had an integral role within the productive process itself, had an integral role imposing discipline, imposing cooperation, organizing production, etc. What rent signifies instead is a extraction of value without the capitalist intervention into the productive process. So in some ways, this is what we're talking about, a passage from profit to rent that in some ways bookends an earlier phase of capital where there was a shift from rent to profit. You know, with the predominance of the industrial era, profit as I'm describing it, with an integral role, the capitalist became dominant. So in some ways, this notion, all of the different figures we're talking about in these 4 days are ways in which capitalist production is organized relatively autonomously from capitalist organization. It still is under capitalist control, but that's what rent is meant to signify. Capitalist production without direct intervention of the capitalist. Okay, that's something. I hope that makes some sense conceptually. The other hypothesis that Tony and I work on is that neoliberalism has to be understood as a response. Neoliberalism, not think neoliberalism in its own terms or as its own creation, but as a response and a recuperation of the forms of liberation and the struggles for liberation that preceded it. So thinking about neoliberalism, so in some ways, here's just an anecdotal example that for some of you might work, which is, I'm reminded of the 1975 essay by Samuel Huntington, in which, as a proto-neoliberal or maybe full neoliberal, he was thinking about what he called the distemper of democracy and the crisis of the state in order to fulfill the demands of a whole list of social subjects. And he even, in a lovely passage in this essay, you have to have that sort of ironic, lovely. In a lovely passage of this essay, it makes a list of all the minorities, he calls them marginal subjects, that are making demands on the state today. He says blacks, Chicanos, women, workers. These are all the marginal groups that are making demands on what the state can do. And so in some ways, I'm seeing that these demands, that these liberation struggles, which he's recognizing, are really the fount of the neoliberal regime as, yes, like I'm saying, not only a response to these struggles, but also a recuperation of their potential. So recuperation of the potential, how that goes back to the first hypothesis. In some way, this notion of rent is meant to recognize a capitalist regime in which there is the autonomous production of value that capital is able to extract. So that's what and so in some sense then, put these two together, one could see, and this is what we're in some ways looking for, one could see that beneath the world of neoliberal control and neoliberal accumulation, there is a series of productive subjectivities that are that are yearning to be free. I don't know what's the next line should be. Something like that. That's where we need to look at that productive basis on which neoliberalism is based and is sucking vampire-like.
Extraction is not something new. Extraction rather characterized the very beginning of historical capitalism. And again, we have kind of bridge toward the topic of primitive accumulation. Marx stressed the discovery of silver and gold in the Americas as a key moment of primitive accumulation. And extraction was a defining feature of capitalism in its early phase. We could go back to debates within post-colonial studies over the last 2-3 decades to highlight the importance of this extractive mode of capitalism in the critical analysis of colonialism and of the relation between colonialism and capitalism. But let me just mention a very kind of powerful image that is proposed by Achille Mbembe in his last book, The Critique of Black Reason, where he speaks of a homo metallicus, a metallic human being, in order to bring together extractive activities of capital in the colonies and the ways in which the human was constructed and exploited. So we are confronted here with, I repeat, a powerful image that already points beyond the extraction of minerals and primary commodities toward, a specific mode of organizing and practicing exploitation of the human. So what do we mean by extraction? I think that this reference to Achille Mbembe allows us to make a first important distinction that you will have encountered, particularly in Veronica Gago's essay, if you had the time to read it. And this is the difference between a literal understanding of extraction and a kind of more expanded understanding of extraction. Literally, extraction refers to mining, but also to new extensive cultures. Just think of soy. That is usually understood as part of the extractive sectors. Let me dwell very shortly on extensive agriculture and on soy. I was kind of struck some months ago doing some research through the Monsanto website when I saw the advertisement of a new transgenic seed Intacta RR2 Pro. This transgenic seed is kind of representative of a new generation of transgenic seeds whose mission is, I quote from the advertisement, to expand into even more marginal areas. So you have a kind of image of a development that is driven by the margins. You have the image of kind of expansion of the extractive frontiers of capital that is not driven by the center, but rather by the margins. And I will come back to this image later because I am convinced that it is quite effective, not merely as far as literal extractive activities, in this case extensive agriculture, are concerned. If we look at contemporary landscapes of extraction, we are confronted with kind of global landscape. We will focus today on Latin America for the reasons I will try to explain. But if you take a look at the SAQ issue, you will find also a couple of very interesting essays on Africa. But extraction doesn't simply refer to the so-called global south. Just think of fracking in North America or in several European countries. So it is a kind of global landscape. But the peculiarity of the Latin America discussion of what is called neo-extractivism is that it is linked with the experience of new so-called progressive and popular governments in the region. We could even say that the critical discussion of neo-extractivism, which is very well summarized by Maristela Svampa's essay, has been kind of point of reference for the reorganization of a critique of the so-called progressive governments, let's say from the left. Neo-extractivism is defined by Maristela Svampa and by many other critical Latin American scholars as the pattern of accumulation which is based on the overexploitation of generally non-renewable natural resources, as well as the expansion of capital's frontiers toward territories previously considered to be non-productive. Again, I mean the advertisement of Monsanto. What is usually added to this definition is that the intensification of extractive activities over the last couple of decades led to a reprimarization of Latin American economies. Again, this is not something new. I was talking about Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation and his reference to the discovery of gold and silver in the Americas. But speaking of neo-extractivism, implies a direct reference to the new progressive governments in Latin America and to their attempt to use what Svampa calls the extractivist rent in order to fund new social policies to address poverty. You will easily understand that there are a lot of very important questions at stake in this debate. One of these questions is precisely neoliberalism. The new progressive governments in Latin America use to define themselves as post-neoliberal. So discussing the kind of material economic basis of the social policies of these progressive governments opens up a very interesting kind of critical angle on the way in which these governments were able to deal with neoliberalism and its legacy. But then we can introduce another quite interesting post, which means post-developmentalism. And this is a kind of very dense signifier. On the one hand, it refers to the buen vivir, to this originally indigenous notion or notions of well-living, to a principle that was constitutionally recognized, at least in Ecuador and in Bolivia. Two countries that are at the center of the critical analysis proposed by Svampa in her essay. Many of you will be familiar with the critical discussion of development and the notion of post-development that has been proposed by scholars like Esteva in Mexico, but also by Arturo Escobar between Colombia and North Carolina and Chapelino. Again, this discussion of post-developmentalism has kind of specific meaning in Latin America, because it was originally linked with the specific history of developmentalism in Latin America. Dependency theory, the very notion of import substitution, and the rethinking of the role of the state within the framework of the CEPAL in the 1960s. And basically, which was the idea behind Latin American developmentalism, to put it in a quite schematic and generic way. The idea was, to kind of foster an industrial development led by the state in order to generalize wage labor as the basis of a new democratic citizenship. If you look now at Latin American so-called progressive governments, you will find that they legitimate themselves through a rhetoric that refers back to the legacy of developmentalism. So such a work as the one done by Maristela Svampa is a particularly tough critique of the rhetoric of the progressive governments, insofar as it shows that the real basis of the social policies of inclusion fostered by these governments is not industrial development. It is rather this process of reprimarization of Latin American economies through the intensification of extractive activities. So post-neoliberalism, post-developmentalism, and the whole set of problems connected to these two signifiers are at stake in this debate. But to this, I should add that another very important question is the kind of changing shape of the world order. And this is a point that is not really dealt with in Maristela's article. But what do I mean? Well, I mean that, for instance, soy is sold to China nowadays. And it is China's demand that has driven this intensification of extractive activities, not only in agriculture, also in the mining sector. And this is a quite interesting question. On the one hand, it refers to the whole question of the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and to the expectations that the rise of the BRICS has raised, particularly in Latin America. I'm thinking now, just to stay in North Carolina, of a couple of articles written by Walter Mignolo on this question. On the other hand, it is very interesting to look at the way in which China intervenes in Latin America, because it gives us an interesting instance of the intertwining between extraction, logistics, and finance that I was mentioning at the beginning. China makes huge investments in infrastructures and in logistics, developing new railways, new kind of communication roads. And nowadays, I mean, you may have heard about the giant project of the new Nicaragua channel. I mean, it would directly connect, the Pacific and the Atlantic, jumping over the Panama Channel. At the same time, if you look at a country like Argentina, the financial support of China has been particularly important in these years when Argentina was, after the crisis of 2001, cut off the Western circuits of credit. And it is again very important now, after the decision of Justice Grisa and the danger of a new default in Argentina. And if you look at the way in which the loans are given by China, you will find again, this connection with extraction on the one hand and logistics on the other hand. So to sum up, I think that such a critique of neo-extractivism as the one well represented by Maristela Svampa's article is very effective in stressing the long-term continuities in the pattern of accumulation and in opening up a critical angle on the new progressive governments. But I will refer to two problems that I have with this kind of approach. One problem of the critique of neo-extractivism lies in the fact that it tends to reproduce a kind of divide between the country and the city, which is often a kind of divide between indigenous population based outside of the city and the urban poor. This leads critics of neo-extractivism to unilaterally focus on struggles against the literal dispossession of commons, which are often, I repeat, indigenous struggles. Svampa speaks of a kind of environmentalization of struggle, kind of shift, from the social struggles that gave the tone to Latin American conflicts in the early 2000s to environmental struggles. So the literal kind of understanding of extraction leads to a literal understanding of dispossession, the word popularized by David Harvey, of the commons, and it leads also to a literal kind of understanding of the commons. The commons are physical kind of goods that are dispossessed and that have to be defended. So it's a kind of, understanding of struggles as resistance to the dispossession, to the taking away of physical commons, which are usually, connected to the land. A second important problem has to do with, the very title of Maristella's essay, Commodities Consensus, with this idea of a kind of transition from the Washington Consensus of the 1990s to what she calls commodities consensus. To put it shortly, the problem with this kind of analysis is that it tends to confine the financial valorization, it tends to confine finance itself to the 1990s. So from this point of view, from both these points of view, Veronica Gago's essay presents a sharp contrast. This is not an essay on literal extraction. Maybe I have to say that I work quite closely with Veronica, so I share her perspective. She's another co-author that could sit with us in this seminar. What does Veronica Gago show in her essay? She focuses on processes of financialization of popular life and economy in Latin America. So her essay is also kind of bridge to the topic we will deal with on Thursday. Maybe we'll come back to her essay. But let me say a couple of words about the meaning of popular life and economies in the Latin American context. Popular economies are at the center of critical debates in Latin America. They are cooperative economies, they are social economies, they are community-based economies. And if you look at the debate, you will find people privileging one or the other definition in order to develop a specific understanding of the relevance of this material fabric of economic practices that, support the reproduction, the physical reproduction of millions of men and women in Latin America. So it's not a marginal kind of phenomenon. Maybe some of you will be familiar with such theoretical approaches as the one developed by Gibson Graham on non-capital. So all these questions, we can return to them later, are implicated in the Latin American discussion of popular economies. And what Veronica shows is the way in which the financial system is penetrating the popular sector's economy through issuing credit and cash loans. One could even say that also beyond Latin America, low-income sectors are the real new frontier of financialization. And here we can make a kind of parallel with what I was saying before about Monsanto's advertisement of the new generation of transgenic seeds. Also in the case analyzed by Veronica, we are confronted with a process of financialization that is driven by the margins. And I think this is a quite interesting point. But just a figure, the consumer credit in Argentina since 2003, between 2003 and 2012, there was a 23 times increase over 9 years. 23 times. It was an explosion of consumer credit since 2003, meaning since the beginning of what is called in Argentina Kirchnerismo, since Nestor Kirchner seized power. So it is quite clear, to go back to what I was saying about Svampa's notion of commodity consensus, that it doesn't make sense to confine finance and financialization to the Washington Consensus, to the 90s. Here we are confronted with an important experience of progressive government, and we are confronted with a 23 times increase of consumer credit in a decade. Moreover, this interpolates in a very radical way, the kind of notion of inclusion that has been crucial to the policies, and not only to the legitimization of progressive government in Latin America. We are confronted with an inclusion through consumption, and not with an inclusion through the generalization of wage labor. There was industrial development in Argentina over the last 10 years, but there was not at all kind of tendency toward, an increase of industrial occupation. Analysis of the transformations of the labor market in Argentina, which is the country I know best in Latin America, show that the process of informalization of labor has gone on in this decade. And I think this is a very important question that we will pick up again over the last days. Transformations of labor connected with the analysis of the workings of contemporary capitalism, also looking at extraction, finance, and logistics. Second and last point I take from Veronica's essay. She proposes an extension of the concept of extraction precisely to analyze the ways in which the financialization of popular life and economies work. She analyzes the financialization of popular life and economy through the concept of extraction. But it's quite clear that in this case we are confronted with a different meaning of extraction, which is also connected with a different meaning of what can be considered the kind of reverse side of extraction, which means the common. In the case of Veronica's analysis, we are confronted with an extraction of value from social cooperation and production. We are confronted with a kind of common that is productive and produced at the same time. So a very different kind of notion of the common with respect to the one that is prevailing in the critique of neo-extractivism and in Svampa's essay. I think I stop here.
Yeah.
Already spoke about.
No, that's good. And so I just have one more conceptual thing to add before stopping, which will be, like we said earlier, about the concept of primitive accumulation. In fact, I just wanted to stop with the last thing that Sandro said. In some ways, we're proposing, I think we're both proposing this, is that extraction be understood as always referred to the common. Extraction always means extraction of the common. And that there are two faces of the common. This is in some ways what Veronica Gago's essay is adding. Like one face of the common, which in terms of extraction one sees very easily, I think, is in terms of the earth and its ecosystems, oil, mining, etc. This is the extraction of that common. What Veronica's proposing is a separate face of the common, or a slightly different one, which is the common as the result of social production, of social cooperation, and that regarded as the common, the extraction of that is also, say it's a separate face of extractivism, and that we trying to think the two together. This will also be for Thursday. I know that we'll have to explain, try to make sense out of such a statement, but I see finance also about the extraction of the common. Like that's the way, I think, the central way of understanding finance too. But let me come back, maybe this becomes clearer with the concept of primitive accumulation. Part of the reason, maybe you already see why primitive accumulation fits in this. Let me just give the brief review of what Marx says about primitive accumulation, by which he's referring to what Adam Smith called previous accumulation. Marx's theoretical problem, at least the way he starts this section, is to say, where did all that wealth come from that Europeans could start capitalist industrial production? Where'd they get all that wealth? And so he in some ways divides it into two. Primitive accumulation involves the violent, always violent, really, means of the appropriation of pre-existing wealth. And so he divides it really in two camps. What he talks about much more extensively is within Europe, the expropriation of the common thought of as either as common lands or as the enclosure, creating land as private property. These are some of the methods of primitive accumulation in Europe, an expropriation of the common in that sense. But going along with that is the other side, which is in terms of conquest, colonization, that as Sandro mentioned, both the slave trade plus the extraction of gold and silver from the Americas, etc., that this is another face of primitive accumulation. Both of these are that. And so there has been, in recent years, I think going along with the same kinds of theories we've been talking about in the last 10 years or so, many critiques of Marx, I think it's often posed, to say that primitive accumulation is not a passing moment, something that happened in, I don't know, the 16th, 17th, 18th century, but something that continues all along with capitalist production. It sometimes is posed as something that's always part of capital, like primitive accumulation doesn't end, it just continues in different forms. Sometimes it's posed as a return, that we are entering a new phase, even since the 1970s, of the reprimarization, that's a hard word that Svampa uses, is sometimes thought of as a return to primitive accumulation from the industrial sector. I think this is all very useful in a way. Oh, and you might think of the David Harvey slogan, which I mentioned earlier, as one version of the contemporary reference to the concept. The notion of neoliberalism as accumulation by dispossession. Accumulation by dispossession, I think, is a kind of shorthand for primitive accumulation as a way of naming the present. Now, I think that there are two limitations to the concept, but this is really worth discussing. One is what I think Sandro just emphasized, which is that the reference to primitive accumulation regards the common primarily as pre-existing and doesn't recognize the production of the common through social cooperation. I would say this is true actually for both what I was calling two faces of the common before. I mean, it's clearly true in the kind of things that Veronica's talking about of creativity of social production, of social cooperation. I would say also that in the notions of the soil itself are already integrated the value of human productivity. But anyway, that's another question. But I think that one of the things that it is, I guess another way of posing the same thing is, what is the nature of the outside that is extracted? Primitive accumulation is always thought in some sense as an outside. And Rosa Luxemburg does this most dramatically, but I think that's a common way of thinking of primitive accumulation. And what is the nature of that outside, thinking of the common as outside, that is extracted? In some ways, I would argue that today the common always exists within a capitalist framework, even when it's a non-capitalist social relations. And that qualifies what the nature of that outside is. Okay, that's my first point about the way primitive accumulation tends to see what is extracted, which I'm trying to think of as the common, and all these things as pre-existing and not something that's produced. The second difficulty that I mentioned at the very beginning, and this is so I can end with this too, of using the term primitive accumulation for this, is that it focuses on the processes of accumulation themselves, I guess obviously, rather than as the mode of production. So when we think of this as a return to or a continuation of the mode of accumulation, we're not thinking about the ways in which productivity, human activity are involved, to say it something like that. It's really the same point maybe as the first one, because if you're regarding the common that is extracted as something that is pre-existing and just there, the oil, the land, even maybe social values, but then it just focuses on that moment of capture, thinking of extraction as an apparatus of capture. But instead, if you think about it in terms of a mode of production, then one can recognize what seems important to me, which is the way that the common is produced in all its various forms, rather than only about the ways in which it is captured or extracted. And it's those, I guess with that too, I I don't mean that one shouldn't use. I don't refer these critiques like one shouldn't talk about primitive accumulation in terms of this. I think I would just want to say that there are limitations to the resurrected, in some ways, use of the concept in order to understand the kinds of operations of extractivism we've been talking about.
It seems to me the missing piece here is agribusiness and the Green Revolution. And that's what turns an old-fashioned peasant sector into farm workers and into the production of these kinds of goods. So I think it's very exciting and the whole sound of extractivism is very exciting. But it looks like, especially when you couple that with the idea of rent, that we're going back to something, and indeed maybe we are, but it seems to me that you could just as much call extractivism a kind of new agriculture. And you talked about Monsanto, you're sort of reaping, harvesting the oil out of the soil and so on and so forth, as you could talk about agriculture as this kind of new agriculture as a kind of extractivism. So, I mean, I think that really, for me, is very interesting and very revealing about the extent of this transformation. And then it also raises theoretical question about which you've been discussing about what slogans are right for this, and what words describe this best without taking us in another direction. And I guess ultimately then, it still raises the question of regression. I mean, going from profit back to rent, is that, I mean, anybody in the classical Marxist tradition would have thought of that as a real regression. To what degree is this regression? It seems to me what you are both trying to do is to show something which is not going back to that, but going into something new, however one judges it.
The addition of the in some ways, seeing the two sides. I found it at first hard to understand with the Latin American authors writing about neo-extractivism, how they added soy into that. Like, how is that extraction? But I sort of did understand it just like the way you said, and you're absolutely right. You could flip the coin too and say, oil is really about a kind of industrial or mass agriculture.
Once you got Monsanto in the middle of that, these things
get brought together, and that's, I guess, the main point. The second thing I was going to say is we have to eventually, I'm not sure if we can even in these 2 weeks, to respond to that second question is in what ways, because I think we both do see the possibilities of an advance, not a regression, but both in the form of capital, but also even more so in the potentials of anti-capitalist struggle, rather than, I think we have to yes, which have to change, and in some ways we have to put meat on the bones, or to give more flesh. That's the expression to that possibility.
I also think that agriculture, the Green Revolution, I mean, is a very important aspect of what we are describing through the category of extractivism. In a way, what I was saying about Monsanto and soy is part and parcel of that, you know. And on the one hand, I think it is interesting to look at the ways in which new peasants' movements are discussing these questions in Latin America, but also in other continents. You know, the whole discussion surrounding the topic of alimentary sovereignty. Alimentary sovereignty.
But food sovereignty or something like that.
Yeah, food sovereignty, yes, is particularly important in this regard. The other aspect, I mean, if you take soy, I mean, you are really confronted with kind of intertwining between extraction, logistics, and finance. Soy is really kind of disrupting space in many Latin American countries. But if you look at the connection between soy and logistics, and here the reference to China is particularly important, it's easy to see that you are also confronted with a continuous production of new spaces. You know. And at the same time, if you look at the prices of commodities, including soy, I mean, these are highly financialized kind of prices. You know, they are more set on the global stock exchanges markets than you know, in a classical market dynamic. And then just a word on the question of rent. We will come back to this question already on Thursday, I think. For me, what is important is to develop kind of nuanced theoretical framework within which to analyze this kind of shift from profit to rent. To put it shortly, I mean, I am very cautious with regard to people who say nowadays everything is rent. There is no profit anymore, you know. For me, the point is precisely to look at the articulation between, you know, different forms, profit and rent. And what is at stake in the attempt to develop this idea of operations of capital, I mean, is precisely this kind of nuanced theoretical framework. We are confronted with strategic operations of capital that are related to rent. But there are also a lot of operations of capital that are quite traditionally related to profit. I mean, so the point is also the kind of articulation between these different and heterogeneous kind of operations.
I have two questions, one of which is perhaps prefigurative in that it should be raised next time, but and it relates to sort of Fred's introduction of agribusiness, and it is that I'm a bit nervous about this binary between profit when capitalists intervened into the production process and rent when capitalists don't. Because it seems to me that while there are formations, there have been social formations of capitalism in which both of those are true, most of capitalism is somewhere in the space in between. Right? And the changing forms of capitalist organization, governance, intervention, that the intervention of the stock market introduced, the intervention of managerialism introduced in its variety of forms, mitigates against such a fairly simple binary choice in the forms of capitalist production of profit. But that's probably coming next time. Yeah. The second question, which you did raise today, has to do with this notion of demand from the margin. The kind of, you didn't call it demand, you called it,
Driven by the margins.
Driven by the margins. And, you know, and the most, I mean, let me use the case of the growth of consumer demand in Argentina. Well, that sounds like a demand-driven market. And one wants to know where the demand, how the demand was produced. And this doesn't sound like a particularly new, innovative development in capitalism, or necessarily one. I mean, I suppose it's good, and I'm all in favor of people who have been deprived of benefits of consumption, demanding consumption, but it's also that capitalism has expanded to increase demand in order to continue increasing its productivity. So I'm a bit unsure what you want to, you know, I mean, I think the same is true if you talk about the extension of extraction economies into the rainforests. This isn't, I mean, there is some benefit to, I can see where indigenous people might want the benefits that come from the possibility of value being produced for their benefit in some ways. But it also doesn't, I mean, I don't see what I gain. I see what's sort of hidden in calling this driven by the margins as opposed to the expansion of capitalist demands into new markets, which seems to me what the old-fashioned way of describing that would be. And like all capitalism, there are gains and losses in the market and in capitalism. Capitalism produces benefits, even as it produces negative exploitative effects. So I'm not sure what you want to where the grounds of this shift in rhetoric is coming from and what it's supposed to signal.
What you're touching on is something that we didn't talk about in the Svampa article, which at least relates to part of what you're saying there, which is that she's critiquing the progressive governments in Latin America that are continuing extractivist development projects, and I am critical of them too. But I think one has to recognize the logic of such arguments, which aren't evil or wrong, to me. So, like for instance, Bolivia and Ecuador, which I think are in some ways the two states most object of this. The state argument in each case is we need to do things that will destroy the rainforest or that will destroy something, to have more oil wells because we need to distribute money to the poor. In my book, it's a lot better than destroying the rainforest and giving money to the rich, which is what you usually do. So it's at least a different kind of argument. And so I think it's an honest, non-corrupt, it's an honest difficulty. And I don't know, when you were saying before that there's certain kinds of trade-offs in the increase of consumption goods and demands, I think that's a real political question that doesn't have an immediate answer. What I think is great about Svampa's article and this perspective in general is recognizing both the shift of the model, that's not a developmentalist model aimed primarily at industrialization, but rather aimed at a different kind of value creation, which really doesn't employ that many people and produces wealth in a different way. So it's just analytically it's helpful, and then politically it refines at least a question. Sorry, that didn't really answer your question, but it was at least part of it.
I will try to add something. First of all, I agree with Michael and with you. If people who never had access to consumption are kind of given this opportunity to consume, this is good, And this is not banal, because there is a huge discussion also in Latin America on consumerism, which is highly moralized. So sometimes it is a bit embarrassing because you are confronted with people who never had problems to consume, who are criticizing the poor because they want to consume. So that's a necessary kind of introduction. But coming to the questions of the margins, the point is that this financialization of consumption is not linked with formal employment. I think this is the main difference, with other instances of mass consumption we are familiar with. The access to consumption is facilitated through financialization and not through formal employment, which means that some features that are usually taken as constitutive of a marginal condition are reproduced. So this is for me a very important aspect of the whole question. These subjects are not choosing to be marginal. They continue to be defined by some characteristics that are usually associated with marginality, although they have access to mass consumptions. So you are confronted with kind of very heterogeneous social formation that is very difficult, very different from the usual image of development, and that makes an important contrast with the rhetorics of the progressive governments. So you are not confronted with a kind of linear transition from a situation in which you have signs of marginality, informal employment, informal economy, to a situation in which, there is a dominating norm, to go back to the question we were discussing outside. And for me, this is a really important aspect of the whole questions we are discussing. I mean, the kind of crisis of the very idea of a norm. First of all, in the statistical meaning of the word norm. And the statistical meaning of the word norm is very important, I mean, it was very important for Marx, for instance. The average labor day, the average socially necessary labor, and so on. I mean, Marx gives us a really wonderful example of a use of the norm in its statistical meaning in order to kind of critically reconstruct the anatomy of a capitalist society. Well, nowadays it's quite difficult, to identify a norm. And I have to add that for a long time, the norm has been associated with free wage labor. So this is the other side of the whole discussion that we have started today. I mean, transformations of labor. I mean, which is the relation between transformations of labor and extractivism in the case of Latin America, of Argentina, which is the relation between, transformations of labor and financialization. Point we will discuss next time. I mean, so if you look at Argentina, I mean, how does Michael Denning say? Wageless life, wageless life, I mean, is a really kind of widespread condition, And there was no substantial change from a statistical point of view, again. There was a qualitative change because, wageless life with consumption is much better than wageless life without consumption, of course. So this is the question. The angle of the norm is, for me, particularly important.
Yeah, two things very, very quickly. The first one, I was like a little bit surprised that you didn't mention the word crisis, the crisis of 2008, for example, which I think was a very good point because it goes well with the argument that it's not a problem of like how the norm of a phase of accumulation find an obstacle and the crisis is the obstacle. The idea is that capitalism is always in crisis, and the crisis is just the form of contemporary accumulation. And the second point is about the relationship between rent and profit, which is, of course, a point that has been like very, very widely developed in latest years, and I've never been like completely persuaded about this kind of process. Even though, Michael, then you cleared it out a little bit better at the end because you were saying that it's not just like a passive dimension, it's just like the parasitical dimensions of rent that capitalism right now is going forward to. So on one hand, I would ask why we should stick to the term itself if we use rent and then we want to underline the fact that it's not just the passively dimensions of the rentier traditionally intended, And for example, I'm thinking that if we want to address the problem of who are the agency of the organizations of a system of accumulation, for example, traditionally, of course, we have either someone that is organizing the organizations of labor, for example, like traditionally the capitalists that like organize labor, for example, when we read it in the great industry chapters in Capital, But of course, we have also one of the biggest agency is the allocation of credit. It solved the problem of the credit systems, And I think that this is a very dynamic dimensions of contemporary capitalism in deciding where the credit supply is going to. It's never an innocent choice why the rates of investments emerge in some place and not in some others, And here I think that there is a very important question about the non-parasitical and the non-rentier dimension of finance. Sometimes there are a lot of people stressing the parasitical dimension of finance, But there is also a very proactive dimension of finance. If we're thinking about, for example, the biggest infrastructural bubble that right now is happening in China, where fictitious capital have the forms of huge freeway of 15 lanes where 2 cars are passing by each day. Because of course, these dimensions of the activity of finance also have to take this form, And this is a very proactive one.
For me, some of the argument about rent is to focus on the generation, from where social cooperation comes. And so, you were already saying this, though, that if one thinks about the industrial capital as a system in which the discipline and organization of production is generated by the capitalist, sometimes in very ugly ways, of course, but that nonetheless that the social cooperation in the factory is planned and implemented by the capitalist. What I think we're trying to indicate in part by focusing on rent is ways in which social production and social organization, social cooperation, are generated outside of capitalist control. That's what's trying to be emphasized. It doesn't mean to me that capital becomes parasitic. And you're right, and there are other ways, of course, in which capital allocates funds, etc. But and that's the way when Fred was asking earlier to fill out in some ways how this could be seen as a step forward rather than a step back. It would be about the focusing on those circuits or practices of social cooperation and a productive cooperation that exist in some sense beneath capital and within capital. That would be emphasizing those is what's aimed at in this. And any of these kind of slogans, whatever, might not work. It's not that I'm that tied to the slogan. What I want is its emphasis on that, in some ways, external character of the capitalist or capitalist control to the generation of social cooperation. That's what I'm aiming at.
Well, the crisis. Yesterday we decided to start with the crisis on Thursday because it seemed to us that it would have been too easy, to start with the crisis today. But you are of course right, and we will come back to this question that is strictly related with the question of neoliberalism that we used as a starting point today, because after the crisis, in the wake of the crisis, the widespread idea was, okay, this is the end of neoliberalism, and in a way, behind this widespread idea, there was a rather simplistic understanding of neoliberalism. And the work we are trying to do, looking at extraction, finance, and logistics, is precisely an attempt to unearth, deeper trends that have to do with capitalism as a mode of production, and that you have to take into account in order to understand what neoliberalism is. And here there is also a kind of interesting parallel with the Latin American situation I was briefly speaking about before, because also in Latin America, you are confronted with this idea of post-neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? I mean, it is privatization, it is the retreat of the state. Now the state is back, at least in the countries with progressive governments, and so neoliberalism belongs to the past. So from this point of view, there is a very interesting and controversial notion introduced by Veronica Gago in her article, and this is the notion of a neoliberalism from below. She takes a different kind of notion of neoliberalism. Let's say a Foucauldian notion of neoliberalism as a point of reference. And she contends, the analysis of neoliberalism cannot be limited to the level of the state, Let's try to understand which is the kind of rationality that penetrates within popular sectors through financialization. So you will see a kind of neoliberalism from below that is not understood as a kind of moral criticism of popular sectors. The opposite is the case. She tries to propose a notion of neoliberalism from below as a field of struggle, looking at the way in which popular sectors are kind of using the financial and neoliberal rationality in order to open up spaces of freedom and equality, to put it with Etienne Balibar. So it becomes much more interesting to speak of neoliberalism from this point of view. And then rent and profit. We'll come back to this question on Thursday, but let me just say that it is important to be clear about the point of view from which we speak of rent and profit. They are not, for us, kind of formal economic categories. We look at rent, we look at profit from the point of view of the subjective experience of exploitation in contemporary capitalism. So in a way, rent and profit point to different experiences of exploitation that we have to take into account in order to understand which is the kind of production of subjectivity we are confronted with in contemporary capitalism. And maybe I also add some words about primitive accumulation from this point of view. Because something that is often forgotten is that at stake in Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation is precisely what we can call today production of subjectivity, production of labor power as a commodity. Production of labor power as a commodity is not merely the separation of primary producers from the means of production. This is a formal moment that Marx stresses in his analysis. But we have to go beyond this formal moment in order to understand what is the production of subjectivity nowadays in contemporary capitalism. And I think that an important moment that is already stressed by Marx, and that is at the center of a quite extraordinary quote by Michel Foucault, the 73 one, La Société Punitive, is the compulsion to work, the production of the compulsion to work. In this quote, Foucault starts by saying, labor is not the essence of human beings, of human nature. He starts making a kind of critique of the young Marx. I say, why is it not the essence of human nature? Huh? Because the compulsion to work is unnatural, and it has to be produced. So if you take this aspect of the production of subjectivity that is at stake in the primitive accumulation, then I think that you have a quite effective angle also on profit and rent, although we need a couple of mediations in order to get there.
I wonder if we could think together about the way in which a wage-less life is also not new, right? It's what women have traditionally done. It's what enslaved and, sort of debt-coerced people have always done. And thinking about this space, the flea market economy or the informal or the things that are always also verging on the criminal, right, as these forms of productivity and of just massive labor, right? So much work and so much time. That lovely piece that Charles Blow had in the New York Times the other day, right, about how much work it is to be poor, and especially when it then gets sort of brought into these financializations of debt and credit, and the ways in which subprime is always like, how are these people going to make the money to even try to pay back some of that principal, much less the interest, who's constant, always working to sell a little something in front of your house or all of those things. Are we still in a place where there can be a double consciousness from these positionalities, or what I think maybe Randy Martin is suggesting is that something else is happening in terms of consciousness and understanding or critical understanding? And just parenthetically, the stuff about rent that Fernando Coronil worked with for Venezuela, and sort of thinking again about that magic of the state and rent as something that's not necessarily new or just with these progressive, but something that these extractive regimes have worked on before, might be helpful for our thinking too.
Yeah, actually, this is perfectly in line actually with your question as well, because I also wanted to move further into this question in the Commons, because I'm on board with you in terms of this new area of social cooperation that produces the common, and how extraction is basically working in that dynamic. But I think it's also important to emphasize that the common also includes ongoing currents of criminality, of fugitivity, of basic threats. And what I've always found really powerful in these assessments of finance is disciplinary aspect. Where you talk about the compulsion to work, the compulsion to work under regimes of credit and debt in order to assert one's subjectivity as a citizen of the world. And then for those who do not go along with that, there's always the state with its sovereign power to go after those particular threats. I'm wondering, though, if this is also a bit of a problematic binary. Is there some sort of particular role of extractive capital, of finance, to also address potential criminality, fugitivity threats that we might be seeing appearing today? In the case of, just in the last few months here, we've seen, different kinds of struggles and movements absolutely disrupt active ongoing logistics, that of capital, infrastructures of capital, even for momentary situations that have created a lot of shudders, throughout the entire, the systems that operate within this country and throughout the world. And I'm wondering what is happening in response to that. We talked about neoliberalism as a response to decolonization, to particular subjectivities that form from that. What are the responses to potential criminality, fugitivity, things that, what Fred Moten might be calling the undercommons, beyond just this area of social cooperation?
I agree with the relevance of the questions you have raised. I mean, wageless life is not new. Yeah, of course. Of course. This is quite interesting if you think of this point from the perspective of development, because in a way it refers to kind of disrupted temporality of development, to the fact that we are confronted with, we use in the work I do with Veronica, we use the work of a Bolivian sociologist, Zavaleta Mercado, who has this very nice notion of abigarrado, which means heterogeneous, which means I don't have a translation of abigarrado. Motley, yes. But anyway, you understand the question. Zavaleta Mercado developed this notion in the 80s, and it was part of a critical understanding of the Bolivian society of the 80s. You know. So it was a kind of limit that had to be overcome. And nowadays, it seems that this abigarrado condition has become a kind of general condition. You know? So mixing up of temporalities, fractured temporalities and geographies. So this is, for me, a very important aspect of the whole question we are discussing, especially from the point of view, you know, of the composition of social cooperation. Because we speak of social cooperation, and then we have to understand its composition, the kind of conflicts, fractures that constitute social cooperation, and so on. And by the way, I have just written with Veronica a quite long essay on this question of an enlarged notion of extraction. It's in Spanish. If you are interested, I'm happy to share it with you. Just send an email to me. Du Bois, well, I have to think about that. Double consciousness, I don't think it really works. It's more, a fracturing of consciousness, multiplication of consciousness, and then the whole question of criminality and so on should also be taken into account. I mean, in this whole discussion, criminality, criminalization. I mean, if you think of Latin America, I mean, this is really one of the most crucial political stakes nowadays in many Latin American countries. And about the undercommons and stuff like that, I have to think a bit. I don't know if now.
No, I think that now. So today was the Argentinian Latin American Day. The other readings won't be focused on Latin America. For Thursday's session, you might have already noticed on the thing that there's one recommended essay, Randy Martin essay, and the other one is optional. The optional essay by Melinda Cooper is really about banking and labor. And we'll explain, you can, I guess, with both essays. You don't have to read anything if you don't want. But because we will account for the essays. But I say read the Randy Martin essay first, and if you can, read the other Melinda Cooper essay also about money. Yeah.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.